this beautiful little image here for me. I don't remember how to share my screen. It's been a while since I've done this. Screen one, share. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So I want to make this as interactive as we possibly can in regards to this. Everybody here is either really experienced, have had a lot of different types of things happen within their contracts, and have probably, in most cases, have wanted to pull their hair out on a lot of different deals in regards to all kinds of things. So we picked out the top 10 things that we should look out for when it comes to contracts on either the buyer side or the seller side. So I'll kind of go over one by one. Neil Mary's done a nice little 10 obstacles to look at here. So as you can see, the first one here is escrow. So what happens when the escrow is put in late? You have an offer, you get it executed, and they have 3 days to put it in escrow. If they don't put it in escrow by day 3, what happens? You know, the deposits are late, and that pretty much constitutes a breach of the contract or a buyer default. So be very cautious when putting money in escrow. If it's not put in time, the seller may send over a release and cancellation and back out of the deal, and most likely make a claim towards that deposit because of the buyer default. It has happened in many different cases. It's not necessarily a common thing, but most people do put their escrow in time. But there are a lot that state that they don't until after inspections, or they're just that type of person that doesn't want to follow the rules of a contract. They want everything done their way. So one of the things that you want to advise a buyer on in regards to this is that if by chance they don't put their escrow in time and an escrow letter is provided to the other party, the seller has a right to cancel. So the other thing when it comes to escrow is, should you do 1 or 2 deposits? You know, they have 2 different spaces there, and even a third as well, to put additional monies, escrow monies in. So if you have a contract where you're only putting a little money down, if it's like maybe a $200,000 or under purchase price, and you want to put a maybe $2,000, $3,000 escrow amount, you could just do 1 deposit. However, if you decide that the buyer or the seller, you know, makes an offer, a counter offer back stating that they want to put more money, or you want you to put more money in escrow, then you typically might want to do 2 escrow deposits. And here's the reason why. If you put the first deposit in late and that seller has the right to make a claim towards that deposit, you're only putting a smaller portion in if you're putting the first deposit in. They can't make a claim towards that second deposit because it's not due yet. Your second deposit you'll usually put in after inspection periods or after the loan approval deadline, depending. So we'll talk a little bit about that. You know, how much is too much of a deposit, you know, when putting money in escrow? There's some condo associations out there, some homeowners associations that require you to put 20% down in escrow. That is a lot of money to put in an escrow account on a contract that a seller has a couple different outs to be able to make a claim towards that deposit. So my opinion is to do 2 different escrow deposits when it comes to this. You do a smaller portion up front, and then there's a section other in the as-is contract on line 39 where you can put an additional sum of money down, maybe after the loan approval deadline, to put that amount, which will abide by the homeowners association, should abide by most homeowners association rules to put that 20% down. You never want to put all of the money up front because of the way the contract, especially the as-is contract, is written. So again, I prefer to do 2 different deposits as long as your customer is willing and, you know, is on the ball and ready to go. If you have a buyer that isn't necessarily, you know, a little bit more lackadaisy on how things go, you might want to do 1 deposit so you're not having to hound them for that second deposit. but you have options in regards to that. Any questions in regards to escrow before we hit inspections? Okay, so escrow, obviously, as you can see in the very beginning of the contract, is very important. Inspections. Usually a buyer and seller will negotiate them per the contract. You have up to 15 days for a buyer to do a home inspection. Usually that gets negotiated down to a common date of around 10 days. Some sellers want less. They want a quick turnover. They want that inspection done. They want to know what's going on, and they want that contingency to be met faster, sooner than later. So you want to make sure that you know, what happens if you need more time? So say, for example, you negotiate in a contract that you have 5 days for inspections, and all of a sudden that you need more time. You haven't got the inspection report back. You haven't fully negotiated everything that the buyer wants or the seller's willing to do, and you need that time. You want to make sure that you put everything in writing. You're not verbally asking for any type of extensions. So you want to make sure that it is signed. That extension is signed by the last day at the very latest of that inspection period. So when does that inspection period end? It ends at midnight on the last day of the inspection period. So if you have 5 days, it ends at midnight on the 5th day. However, if it ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday, it will extend to 5 p.m. on the following business day. So if Monday's a holiday, it will be Tuesday. So make sure in your addendums, buyer and seller agree that that they will be extending the inspection period for X amount of days. Or you can use the pre-custom extension addendum already pre-built out, where you just have to put in the date, check it off, put in the date, and have both parties sign. Please make sure that when you have that before the inspection period is over. If you don't have that before the inspection period is over, that buyer is basically deeming that property to be acceptable. And we'll go into that a little bit in a few minutes here in regards to that. Now, what happens if a release and cancellation was sent over during the inspection period and the seller refuses to sign and wants to deposit? God, I've been hearing a lot about that lately. So what now? Well, the contract does not stipulate a time frame for the seller to give back or sign a release and cancellation if they're going to do so. So typically what happens is that a broker will get involved, usually around the 7th day that it's not signed. We haven't heard a response from the seller. Now the broker will call the other broker and have a conversation with them to try and get them to sign it. If we have to go one step farther, then the buyer has to retain an attorney to draw up a demand letter. Usually when a demand letter is sent over, a seller will most likely sign it because they really don't want to have to go through the whole process of getting an escrow deposit. Typically, from what I've seen, is the expense to go after escrow usually costs anywhere from $2,000 to $2,500 just to go after an escrow deposit. So if it's less than that, it's not even worth it. Could be less, it could be more, depending on all the different types of situations that are going on with a contract. But that's just pretty much bottom line. So usually, you know, this works. However, if it doesn't, they'll need to retain an attorney to go further. Most cases, once they read that contract, the broker gets involved, or a demand letter goes over to the other side. They'll sign it, send it back. The release and cancellation will go to the title company, and at that point, the title company will release the funds. How about this? We request repairs to be done by the seller, but they haven't answered. So if you've gotten the report back, and let's just say, for example, it's a VA FHA loan, and especially VA, where you're fully aware that the VA lenders or FHA guidelines require a roof leak, fascia boards, chipped and peeling paint, those types of things to be done and fixed before closing. And you've asked for those repairs to be done. However, that seller hasn't gotten back to you. They're still hemming and hawing over it, and they're not sure. But you're on that last day of your inspection period. That day, for whatever have your buyer sign a release and cancellation anytime during that day. So if by chance that they don't go and sign the addendum that you've originally signed, that you're sending that release and cancellation over by the last day of your inspection period. Because after that, again, the buyer has deemed that property to be acceptable. The property being acceptable also means permits, liens, and any type of code violations. And we'll go into that in a few minutes in regards to all of that. But you want to make sure that you're protecting the deposit. So if they haven't, you want to send that release and cancellation to that seller on the last day. So be prepared. Talk to your buyer about it. Listen, we have not heard back. We've been talking back and forth. However, I want to protect your deposit. I'm here to protect you. Just going to have you sign a release and cancellation. And if by chance if they have not extended the inspection period, or signed the agreement to do any repairs, or renegotiated something else and signed it by the last day of the inspections, I'm sending over this release and cancellation because, Mr. Buyer, I want to save your $10,000 deposit. So just be very cautious in regards to the inspection periods, the timelines, and just a little tip to have a release and cancellation signed just in case something happens and nothing gets negotiated. Now, if the buyer decides that they feel that the property's in the condition that they're okay with, then by all means proceed further. And the addendum for the repairs or anything like that does not need to be signed. It just needs to, you just need to make sure that all parties are on the same page. Any questions in regards to inspections?
Nope, you're the best.
Steve, thank you. Loan application and loan approval. This was a big one. A lot of buyers think that they can do the application to the homeowners association at any time during the duration, as long as they know that they get approved before closing. The condo, the contract states that the buyer is obligated per the contract to make application within the lender within 5 days of the contract being effective. So by not making application in time, it is a buyer's default. Therefore, if the buyer decides to back out of the contract later and the seller's attorney is aware of this, they could lose their deposit. So you want to make sure that that they're making that application on time. So for example, if they basically state that, okay, well, I can't get a loan approval where, we're not being able to extend anything, the seller's not giving us an extension, I'm just going to send over a written notice and a release and cancellation and get my deposit back. Well, if the seller is aware that they did not make application within those 5 days and that attorney is aware of it, they may be able to make a claim towards that deposit. So make sure that your buyers are fully aware that that application needs to be made to the lender within 5 days. The loan approval is years ago, probably 5-7 years ago, the loan approval deadline used to be called a loan commitment. It is no longer a commitment, and a loan approval will have conditions. They might have 1 or 2 conditions, or they may have several contingencies. One of those may possibly be the appraisal contingency on there. You want to make sure that you all are reading that loan approval thoroughly to see what those conditions are. Because, for example, if you have an appraisal that goes past that loan approval deadline, you want to know whether that loan approval has that appraisal as a contingency and what does it exactly say in there, because that buyer may have a right to go to that deposit. So if you're on the seller side, you're just extending more contingencies out further and further for that buyer to be able to back out. So if by chance that appraisal comes in 5 days before closing, and they managed to pull everything together, but all of a sudden that appraisal is denied, the appraisal comes in lower, and they want to back out, they might have a right to do so and get their deposit back, and it just puts your seller in a really bad position. So loan approval, reading the contingencies is very important. Also with loan approval too, on the seller side, if you have not received the loan approval by the loan approval deadline date, typically it's 30 days. We're seeing them, a little bit sooner. With timelines of everything going on with lenders, I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to do any kind of loan approvals any sooner than 25 to 30 days because of what's going on. We're seeing a lot of extensions happening in regards to loan approvals and closing dates because the lender can't pull everything together in time, so just be very cautious of that. So the seller, from the day after the loan approval deadline, has 3 days to be able to back out of that contract. So why would a seller want to do that? Well, for example, if they have a backup offer that's a little bit better, maybe it's a cash deal, or there's something that's a little bit more appealing to that seller for whatever reason, and they're not 100% sure that this current buyer will be able to get the place, they can actually back out of the contract and return the money to the buyer and then go full force with the other deal, the other deal to close that one out. So make sure that you're very cautious of those 3 days. Try and get the extension, or deny, send written denial that they can't get a loan if you're fully aware of that, so that the buyer can have their money back. The buyer's rights. So if a loan, the loan approval doesn't come in, there's 3 options basically for a buyer and a seller. Number one, if the appraisal comes in a lot lower than what the purchase price is, the buyer has the right to back out of the contract if they're within their loan approval deadline. Number 2 is to extend the loan approval to give the lender a little bit more time to be able to pull everything together, pull the contingencies together, and so forth. Or 3, back out and basically extend. Those are the only 2. There's really not any 3. I apologize.
Michelle, quick question.
Yeah.
Donna asked on the chat.
Sorry, I'm not
If the
looking at
buyer
the
does
chat.
not make the application within 5 days, is the seller able to request the second deposit that hasn't been given yet?
So you could renegotiate something like that, because the seller has the right to be able to back out. If you feel like the seller could play hardball, saying, all right, you guys have defaulted on this contract, and you were supposed to put $5,000 into escrow. I'll be willing to keep going forward with this if you guys agree to put another $5,000 in escrow. You could renegotiate that at that point, absolutely. But usually, or you just send a release and cancellation at that point if they say no. But you want to do those types of negotiations within the day after they're supposed to put that money in escrow. No further, otherwise it could be considered that the seller deemed that default acceptable in the contract. So just make sure you do it reasonably within the time frames of any of the contingency defaults. Any other questions? I don't have my question thing up, so. Here we are. I have to see the chat now. Let me see. Sorry, guys. Yeah, Monique, try to keep it under your escrow deposits. You say always keep it under 6K. It to stay under small claims court. That's a very good thing. I would definitely agree with that 100%. I mean, you want to keep it as low as possible, especially if you're on the buyer side. The higher, the better, because like I said, it costs money to actually go after, make a claim towards that deposit. So if you're on the buyer side, going under 6K is definitely good advice. So then we answered Donna's question. So, all right, let's go to permits and code violations.
I think she was referring more to if the buyer defaults because they didn't put their application in, are they still entitled to get that second deposit that wasn't made yet?
Oh,
but was going to be made?
Sorry, I didn't read that. No. So for example, if the first deposit was due within 3 days, and then the second deposit is due on the 8th day, like say you had 7-day inspection period, and on the 8th day, the second deposit, and at that point, you would only have to be able to make a claim for the first deposit. If they go back past the second deposit time frame, then you can make a claim towards both of them. Excuse me. Let's go into permits, code violations, and liens. Number 4. The contract favors the seller if the buyer does not address the issues during the inspection period. You want to make sure that you really read the inspection clause of that contract. So for example, if the title company finds that there are open permits on a home and the buyer wasn't aware of them until closer to closing, the buyer may be assuming those issues. So you want to have an attorney, or we have a clause here as well, draft up a clause addressing that during the duration of the contract, the title company, if the title company becomes aware of a permit, code violations, that the seller will close them out before closing at their expense. The contract, the as-is contract specifically states that the seller, if this clause is not in here, that the seller only has to assist in helping the buyer close out the permits, the open permits. So for example, the buyer has to expend the money. The seller doesn't have to spend any money in regards to closing them out. The buyer has to go and do all the legwork. And if there's any forms or anything like that the seller has to sign, then the seller will sign them in assisting and helping out of the closing. But they don't have to go to the permit. They don't have to call the city. They don't have to have, call the city to have any inspections or anything like that. The buyer has to do all the legwork. So if you're working with a buyer, you want to make sure that you have a clause in there stating that the seller will close out all open permits, liens, close all that stuff out, or deal with them before closing. Very important that you have that clause in there. If you don't have a clause like that in there, email us and we'll email you it so you can put it in all of your contracts. I have a contract on actually I'm the seller's agent on a property right now where we put it under contract. It's a good friend of mine, and she received the offer with a $60,000 first initial deposit, $60,000 on a $600,000 property, and the buyer's agent didn't put in this clause whatsoever, and we found out that there was an open permit for a fence from 13 years ago, and the seller's like, I don't want to deal with this. It's been a nightmare from my ex-husband since day one, and it's been open for 13 years, and I'm not going to do anything about it whatsoever. So per our contract, it just states that the seller is only obligated to assist if the buyer chooses that they want to back out, or that they want to help close it out, I'm sorry. So the buyer has assumed the responsibility of that open permit because they want the property really bad, and the seller doesn't have to do anything in regards to it. So if you're on the buyer side, you want to make sure that you have a clause like that in there to protect your customers as best as you possibly can. Anybody have any questions in regards to permits and stuff like that? Close out the chat, it seems to go away. Perfect. Let's go into furniture. So furniture and contents, inclusions and removal. Removal is just as important as including furniture in a contract. So you want to make sure that on the as-is contract, if you look at page 1, line 22, it states that personal property items included in the purchase price has no contributory value and shall be left for the buyer. So just above line 22 is line 21. This is where you would you would add any additional items that that buyer would want. Example, washer and dryer is not in all of those items that are listed in there. Pool equipment, microwave, stuff like that is all things that you want to add in there. Now, if the whole entire property is completely furnished with all the way down to the silverware, you want to make sure that you add an addendum, Exhibit A, and attach it to the contract. So how do you attach it to the contract? On page 11, where all of the addendums attachments are, there's a section where it says Other. On Other, you would just put Exhibit A and check it off as you're adding there. Now, Exhibit A will have all the itemized things that that buyer is obtaining within the home as well. And on line 22, it specifically states that the personal property has no value whatsoever in regards to the purchase price of the home. So that is one way about adding furniture in there. Now, if you have a built-in wall unit that had a TV on it and the buyer hates it, doesn't want it whatsoever, make sure in that contract it states that the seller will remove the wall unit. Because if you don't add that to the contract and you negotiate it verbally, then all of a sudden the day of walkthrough, you're going through and you're like, the seller didn't remove the built-in wall shelf system or whatever it is. Basically, they have no obligation to have to actually remove that item if it's not in writing whatsoever on an addendum or in the contract. So make sure you add anything that you want them to remove in that contract. It's very important that you add that in there at the very beginning. Just like also when it comes to plants in the backyard, I have a story where somebody had a staghorn in a tree. It was very expensive, beautiful property, millions of dollars. And the wife of the buyer walked in and said, I love this house, I want this house. The whole backyard is beautiful. Well, the staghorn was actually a present for their wedding. So the seller actually wanted to take it. Well, that staghorn was not actually in the contract whatsoever. So when the seller took it, the buyer had a $400,000 deposit sitting in escrow that they walked away from because that staghorn was one of the things that they really wanted. Now, that to me, that must have been a really beautiful staghorn for $400,000 deposit. But at any rate, make sure you're adding stuff like that into the contract. If the buyer specifically states, oh my God, I love this, put it in there. Doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt anything to add that in there as long as you're negotiating. That whole deal probably wouldn't have went through if they did that right from the get-go, and they could have found another property and so forth and moved on with their lives. But they went through 30 days of going through the motions and all of these hiccups and and so forth just for that to happen. So that's how you make sure that your personal property and stuff like that is added in the contract.
Michelle, real quick, I just noticed a question on Facebook. Where can they find the verbiage about the permit and liens to add to contracts?
Email support@locationre.com and I will email it to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Layla, I'm just reading your message. You have a new listing where the seller wants to take everything, including the appliances, personal properties, and some fixtures. Make sure you add that to the listing agreement of all the things that they're going to be taking. So you and LoKation Real Estate, or I'm sorry, the seller and LoKation Real Estate are all on the same page of what's going to be taken. And then also in broker remarks, make sure that you put it in broker remarks that these things will be removed so that everybody's on the same page in regards to that. And also make sure that on the contract that those items are specified on there as well. So you're covering yourself in 3 different ways, showing that, showing the buyer's agent what's not coming with the property, showing the, and then making sure that it's a contractual agreement as well at the end of the day between the buyer and the seller. So you're saying the house is either a major renovation or would it be a tear down? I see. Yeah, I mean, if it's a major tear down or anything like that, usually an investor will go in there and they probably won't even really care about stuff like that anyways. So, yeah, or the other thing, if they really want to take those, the seller can provide an allowance, a credit to the buyer for a certain amount of money in regards to replacing if they choose to do that as well. So, but definitely put it in those 3 places. Right, that was a addenda. All right, so we're going to, hold on, I think I just got ahead of myself. Nope. Addendums and clauses. So if you presented, so what constitutes an effective executed contract? Now, Layla, I'll take a peek at it for you. write down the property address and I'll take a peek. If you presented an offer and the offer gets sent over to the listing agent along with addendums, so you have the lead-based paint addendum, condo rider, maybe a couple other addendums or maybe none other ones. If you're the buyer's agent and you are sending that contract over, so you have the contract and the 2 addendums, and the listing agent only sends you back the contract and 1 addendum, or maybe just the contract, that is not an executed contract. You sent over 3 forms, you must receive back 3 forms signed and fully executed before that contract is actually executed. Now, if you are on the seller side and the buyer has presented you an offer, and the only offer that come over was with a contract, and that's it. But it also needed a lead-based paint and a condo rider, but the buyer's agent didn't present any of that. You send that contract back signed without those addendums, that is an executed contract. So whatever you receive and send back, you have to send the same things back in order for it to be an executed contract. After the fact, if you have a lead-based paint signed, homeowners association or whatever signed after the fact, your contract is still executed if they weren't presented initially. So just so you're aware of how that works in regards to making the contract effective in your timelines when your timelines actually start. So you want to also make sure that you're using the correct addendums. I see a lot of our agents actually using the CRISP, the CRSP addendums with the as-is contract. Make sure that you're actually using the as-is addendums. They're all literally on page 11 of the contract. They're all labeled out A, B, C, D. If your addendum does not match A with A, it's not the right contract. So you'll see on the bottom left of that addendum, it'll say CR-5X, and then whatever letter it is, you know you're using the right addendum. Those addendums, and the majority of them, they all have a clause in there where they are referencing, a majority of them have something where they're referencing back into the contract. So if those timelines or whatever they're referencing back into the contract, if it's a financing thing, you want to make sure that they're adding up. Otherwise, it could say something completely different on that addendum where you're thinking it's saying something different, and all of a sudden you've got a big problem on your hands because timelines are different than what the actual contract states in it. All the addendums supersede the contract. So whatever that addendum you're using, that's exactly what is going to be, used in court or mediation or anything like that, the addendum supersedes. So if you're using the wrong contract and you're trying to say, go off of what the contract actually states, it'll be a big hiccup for the buyer or the seller. So just make sure. If you decide that you want to use a CRISP addendum, or maybe even the Realtor Association or the Broward, Palm Beaches, and St. Lucie Realtor have their own condo and HOA riders as well. If you want to use those, you can, as long as there's nothing in them that dictate something otherwise in that contract. On page 11, under the addenda and additional terms, just add it in the other section. You're just adding the Broward, Palm Beach, St. Lucie's condo rider. You are allowed to use it. It doesn't mess with the contract. However, Jonathan, your managing broker, highly recommends you use the same addendums with the same contract, and so do I. So just be very cautious in regards to that. So if you do use your different addendums, you'll most likely see one of our compliance folks probably kick it back because it is not the same. If you're using it for a specific reason, just put a note or respond back to us on why you're doing it, because our file must be as complete as possible. So if we have to go back to it 5 years from now, we'll never remember. Number one, we never know what's really going on with your deal, so we have to use as much information as possible to ever fall back on if ever needed. So also keep in mind, licensed realtors are not attorneys, so therefore all of the clauses that you add in your contract, it doesn't even matter if it's just the simplest of verbiage. Make sure that your verbiage or your clause in your contract is fully written out. If you miss one word or don't do a complete sentence when it should have been complete, it could misconstrue what you're trying to say. An attorney can completely flip it around, and all of a sudden now it's something saying something different. So have myself or Jonathan review your clauses that you're putting in there, especially if they're a little bit more complicated. Or if the customer has an attorney, make them draw up all of the clauses for the contract. Make them do their homework, their work. You don't want to ever draw, if the customer has an attorney, you never want to draw up a clause. Have them do it whatsoever, because they're the ones that will protect the buyer more than us as real estate agents will, because they have more legal knowledge than we do. So that's addenda and clauses. So use the right ones. Make sure you're not drawing up clauses. You're not an attorney, and so forth in regards to that. So what's next? The association application and questions the seller should ask. So we have the condo and HOA association addendums, and two of them are completely different. So, but they both state that the seller must initiate and the buyer must make application within 5 days of the effective date. So at the same time they're trying to make application with the lender, they also need to make application within the association. So if they default on either one of these and they get denied a loan or something like that, and the seller feels like they were not working in the buyer, in the best interest of the contract, and they didn't make application to either the lender or the association, they could hire an attorney and make a claim towards those deposits. So these timelines are extremely important in these contracts, and you must stress as a real estate agent to your customer that they've got to put those in within the timelines. So if you're on the listing side, I would definitely be asking for the association applications as soon as possible to help out your fellow buyer's agents to get those applications. Sometimes it's really hard for a buyer's agent to obtain them themselves. You know how associations are, especially with what we've got going on today. Just be a little bit more proactive to try and make the deal go as smoothly as possible. It also states, both of them also state that if the buyer is to be approved by the association at least 5 days before closing. So if that buyer is not approved by the association within 5 days before closing, the buyer has the right to back out and get their deposit back. So number one, they have an inspection period that they can get back out on. They have a loan approval contingency that they can get back out on. They possibly have an appraisal contingency that they can get back out on, a homeowners association or condo rider that they could back out on. And I'm sure there's a couple others that I'm not even thinking about at this very moment. So you just want to make sure that you can do, as a seller's agent, anything that you possibly can, and even as a buyer's agent, anything that you possibly can to make sure those applications are in on time, and that the association has an efficient enough time to be able to pull that through. And then if you're on the selling side, that you're in contact with that association to make sure that they're approved within 5 days of that closing date, so that they can abide by that as well. The other thing that I want to stress to you about is in regards to the condo rider. The seller should coordinate with a condo association to properly fill out that condo rider prior to an offer. Yes, the buyer's agent, if there's a loan, will do an estoppel letter. An estoppel letter is where they send it to the association. They ask if they're delinquent. They ask, is there any liens, litigations, assessments, all of that stuff. The seller wants to do their best as they possibly can to ask the association as much information. Example, do they have the first right of refusal? Are there any other fees, like a security deposit for the association, litigations, special assessments for the past 12 months are considered pending, and sprinkler system retrofit. If the association actually forgoed, I guess, not to do the sprinkler system retrofit, the seller must provide written notice to the buyer. So there are things that condo rider actually states that the seller has to do in regards to it. So if you're on the selling side or the listing agent, make sure that you are helping that seller know what they need to try and find out as best as possible. so that you can put it on that condo rider. If, for example, that there's any special assessments after the effective date on the condo rider that were not disclosed at the time of the property becoming effective, that contract states that the seller is obligated to pay them. So if you haven't done your homework, or the seller hasn't done their homework on any types of special assessments, that potentially could be a hefty bill for that seller if they were unaware. So just be very cautious in regards to that, because usually that comes up within an estoppel letter, and the estoppel letter isn't done, 3 weeks into the contract, and all of a sudden now the seller's got this huge bill that's an assessment that they were completely unaware of. So just be very cautious in regards to that. Also, you want to make sure that the seller has all of the condo documents, including the frequently asked questions. There's 7 documents that the seller must provide the buyer. And one of them is the frequently asked questions. Now, an attorney, if they're a good attorney, will go through that and say, well, has the buyer received all of the 7 things that they're supposed to get? The buyer, everybody was like, oh yeah, they got all of it. Well, they didn't get the frequently asked questions, and they didn't sign the receipt for condo docs. So how do you know what they really received? And if they didn't, that attorney could potentially back a buyer out of a deal when the seller wanted to make a claim towards a deposit. And, now the seller's out that money when they should have had it because the buyer defaulted for many or one reason or whatever. So make sure that the seller is obtaining the most recent condo docs, frequently asked questions, etc. If there is no frequently asked questions with an association, because some of them don't have them, make sure that you can clearly state that there is not one for this property and have them, or for this association, and have them sign a receipt of condo docs, excluding the frequently asked questions, because it does not exist. So make sure you guys do your homework on that, especially if you are on the seller side. The other form that the on the Condo Rider Association states is that the governance form it's the seller's obligation to provide the buyer the governance form. So best practice is to send that governance form to the buyer when you send them the condo docs. It's the seller's responsibility to send that to them. Therefore, it's also the listing agent's responsibility to send that to the buyer's side. So just make sure that you have it along with it, and then they can sign that on the receipt of condo docs if they've received that as well, so that gets checked off. Any questions in regards to the association application and questions the seller should be asking? No? Okay. Another fun one. The appraisal issues. Using the appraisal addendum versus not using the addendum. So which is better, to use or not to use? Well, the as-is contract states, paragraph, if loan approval has been deemed obtained or deems to have been obtained, as provided above, and the buyer fails to close this contract, the buyer has a right to cancel this contract if, I'm only paragraphing number 3, there's 3 different things. So number 3 is the appraisal of the property obtained by the buyer's lender is insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval. So if it's insufficient to meet the terms of the loan approval, that means that that loan approval would have to have the condition of the appraisal on there in order for this section or this clause to work for that buyer to be able to back out. So if the loan approval was obtained, and I would highly recommend that as the listing agent, to see it, or even as the buyer's agent as well, to review the loan approval. And like I said before, the loan approval is not a commitment. They're always going to come with conditions, and usually one of them is the appraisal if it has not been done before. I'm seeing more and more that the appraisals are actually being done after getting loan approval or some type of an acceptance from the lender stating that they're going to proceed to go forward. So just be very cautious in regards to what those conditions are. If you use the appraisal contingency addendum, you are in essence actually providing a due date of when the appraisal is to be completed by. Pre-written in the contract, it's 10 days before closing or a specified date. So you could put a date in there, or the appraisal has to be done at least 10 days before closing. The reason why they put 10 days is because they've got to pull everything together. The underwriting has to review the appraisal. They have to pull the package together, and they have to abide by CFPB guidelines. So 10 days is literally like the last day that that appraisal really could come in, so that there's no extensions following after the fact, or a specific date if you wanted to do something after. So whatever the date that is put in there, if you do not have the appraisal back by then, the contingency is considered waived if it is not received by. So if that appraisal, if you don't get that appraisal back on the 10th, or say on the 11th day before, or which would be the 9th day before closing, then that appraisal contingency is considered waived. And if there's a deficiency within that appraisal, and it comes in lower, that buyer would have to come up with those additional funds, or they're considered defaulting on the contract. So the appraisal contingency could be, it's a really good addendum, in my opinion, I think, for the seller side, because you could actually shorten that time frame up, saying I want that appraisal to be ordered within like 5 to 7 days of the contract. They've made application, the 5th day, you know, the 7th day or something like that after the effective date. I want that appraisal to be ordered and done within the next 7 days, so you could have it 15 days before closing. So you could actually shorten that appraisal time frame out, which forces that buyer to actually do that appraisal sooner. On the buyer side, you definitely, if you feel like that appraisal is going to come in later than after the loan approval, you definitely want to use the appraisal contingency, but you want to shorten, or you want to lengthen, that time frame up as much as possible, so that if the appraisal does come after the loan approval, that you have that addendum to fall back on. So the other thing I can't stress enough is, if you guys use that appraisal contingency, you want to make sure that the amount that you put in there is actually the purchase price of the property, not the loan amount or anything less. By putting anything lower, a lower number in there could actually harm the buyer in obtaining a loan. If that appraisal comes in lower, that means that the loan amount that they're actually going to get is going to be less, and that they actually have to come up with more money at closing. So if by putting the purchase price in there, everything will align a little bit more appropriately. Now, if it doesn't appraise actually at the purchase price, there's 3 options that could potentially happen with it. Number 1, the buyer has the right to back out by sending a release and cancellation, stating that the appraisal didn't match. Thank you very much. I want my money back. So you put the money going back to the buyer. Both buyer and seller can meet in the middle. So if it appraises $10,000 under, one could come up 5, one could go down 5, or the other option is the seller could just come down the $10,000 to the appraised value, and then everybody moves along towards the closing. So, however, if the loan comes in after the loan approval deadline, it's going to really determine on what the loan approval conditions are in regards to backing out. So if you have any questions in regards to this, have Jonathan or I review it to make sure that, you know, your contracts are on the up and up, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed when writing it, because appraisal issues could be major problems when it comes to the contract, especially if they're kind of done later in the game. Any questions in regards to appraisal issues? Anybody seen anything lately that they've dealt with, or any questions in regards to it? You guys can open up your mics too and speak freely. It's up to you.
You're the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. All right, walkthrough and closing date. So here's another thing about walkthroughs. I believe the walkthrough should be done the day of the closing date. You could do it before, you could do it after. You're even allowed to do a second walkthrough as well. So if you wanted to do one a couple days before, and the buyer felt like they wanted to do a second walkthrough, the contract allows them to do a second walkthrough if needed. But I would highly recommend the day of closing that you do that walkthrough. I've experienced where we've done a walkthrough a couple days before closing. It was in a foreclosure property, and the buyer went out of town and was going to do a remote closing. The day of closing, we didn't think anything of it, went to closing. The buyer flew into town that same day and walked to the property, and the whole air conditioning unit outside was stolen. So if they had actually done the walkthrough the day, or we had actually done the walkthrough the day of closing, or one of us went there, this was 100 years ago, but, and I learned my lesson, that you definitely want to do your walkthroughs the day of closing, because if there's anything missing or anything like that, that's the last drop deadline for you to go after anything. Now, the contract used to state that the seller had to leave the property broom swept clean. Well, it doesn't state that anymore. It doesn't state that the property has to be left in any shape other than basically the way that they left it. Landscaping, pool has to be maintained, so forth. But it doesn't actually state anything about the property being cleaned. So it is recommended that, to set the expectation of how the buyer would like the condition of that property to be in. So if you want that property broom swept clean, you want that seller to provide a housekeeper or a house cleaner to go in there, whatever the expectation of that buyer. If you feel like that buyer is really nitpicky, then just put in the additional clauses: seller to professionally clean the property before move out. The other thing is at the time of walkthrough, if the property, you've asked for the washer and dryer, for example, and if that washer and dryer is no longer on the property during walkthrough and it was on the contract, what are your buyer's options? Well, here's the thing about that. If there's any damage to the property, or there's missing items that were on the contract stating the buyer was to receive, you can negotiate with the other party stating to put money in escrow, having a credit for the repairs so the buyer could do it after closing, a credit towards the washer and dryer if they've already taken them off the property and they're not going to bring them back, or play hardball stating they're not going to close until something is negotiated. At that point, if the buyer feels like they're not going to close until something needs to be taken care of, I highly recommend that they speak to an attorney, because at that point, an attorney will need to step in and fight for them in regards to whatever the situation is. If the buyer's willing to bring them back, bring the items back or whatever, so forth, then have them bring them back and then go to closing. But you definitely want to delay. The problem is if the seller completely 100% refuses to do anything about it and basically says, take a hike, the buyer has two options. Take it as it is, and they've got the property, the washer and dryer is no longer there, you just want the property, just go to the closing table, close on it, the property is yours. If the buyer feels like they're completely, the seller's completely in the wrong, and they really want to hire an attorney that same day and have that attorney proceed further, because if they don't go to closing, then the day after, it's considered that the contract is a dead deal. So something has to be negotiated. So just be very cautious. The buyer can always ask for things and play a little bit of hardball, but the seller technically does not have to really do anything if they are real jerks about it. So just be very cautious in regards to that. So broom swept clean isn't in there. If that's what they want, make sure that's in there. If they want somebody to come in there and clean it, make sure that's done as well. So you definitely want to notify the title company if there's any issues, put them on notice so that they can work with the sellers on their side about putting money in escrow, crediting, or something like that. So you always want to advise the title company what is going on. One of the reasons why, if you're on the seller side, always to have another attorney, like our in-house title company, the closing team, our attorney do the seller side docs. You have seller side attorney assistance in regards to that, and then the buyer can have their own side for their closing too. In my opinion, I think it's always best to separate the title companies and never have one title company work the deal. That is my experiences. You can always have both parties work with one title company, but I always like attorney representation, so my sellers always have their own representation, and so forth. So that's something for you guys to think about as well. Brian, when it comes to leases, that's a whole different ballgame when it comes to the as-is contract. Leases, there is actually a stipulation in there that once that lease is signed and you go through the walkthrough of the property and it is not broom swept clean and it's ratherly not move-inable whatsoever, maybe the AC is not working. I actually just spoke to somebody in regards to a situation like this. There's a contract that states, the lease states that the landlord, I have to switch gears here. The landlord has up to 7 days to be able to fix that. So that tenant technically has to go and find other living situations if they're not going to move in there for that time frame, and it's not at the expense of the landlord. It's at the expense of the tenant to actually have to find a place to live within that duration of those 7 days. If after those 7 days that landlord says that, well, we're not going to fix those items, I can't get those items fixed, that's when the tenant actually has the right to cancel that lease. They have to give the landlord the ample amount of time in order to fix it. So in that case, I would probably, if I was the agent on that side, try to do a walkthrough the day before just to make sure everything's on the up and up before my customer sees it, if you really are worried about cleanliness in regards to that, so that you can get on the other side, get on the listing side, the landlord side, to get that taken care of right away. Brian, I hope that answers your question. Layla, thanks for the address. I'll take a peek at it. What else we got? So that's the walkthrough and the closing date. Any other questions in regards to that? And keeping in mind, actually, with broom swept clean and stuff like that, this is one of the reasons why I don't like going straight to the lease. The contract to lease is a very vital part of the process. It talks about all of the monies, the negotiations, what the expectations are. You can state in there that you want a broom swept clean. See, as a real estate agent, we cannot put any additional terms. We can't write broom swept clean. We can't write anything in that lease whatsoever. An attorney has to do it. But on the contract to lease, there's an other section where you can completely fill in, what your obligations are in regards to what that landlord, what you want that landlord to do. So, and if they're agreed upon, then you have an attorney draft up those, an addendum in regards to everything that you specified. Number one being broom swept clean is very important, or have a professional cleaner come in there and clean it. With leases, it happens all the time. So just be very cautious of it. Let's go into the last but not least, the pre-posting occupancy and tenant occupied properties. So both the addendums, addendum number T for Tom and addendum number U for Umbrella, are the pre and post occupancy addendums. Now you can add those addendums to your purchase and sales contracts, your as-is contract, and therefore allow the buyer to move in or the seller to stay a little bit longer if need be before or after the closing. Those addendums should be put into place, and leases should be prepared by either party. Most likely the landlord will be preparing it. However, I highly recommend a real estate attorney draft up the leases, because you have a lot of different things to think about in regards to security deposits. What happens if there's damage, and so forth? What happens if the person doesn't move out in time? There could be an eviction that needs to, they become squatters. So you want to make sure that an attorney completely drafts up the lease and goes from there. However, the last thing that I will say is that your managing broker, Jonathan, highly recommends not to do a pre-occupancy stay, especially within the time frame of what we've got going on now with COVID and all of these extensions and so forth of evictions and all of that. So just be very cautious of it, and I would highly recommend just to do some extended stay place or something like that, Airbnb, until the time that the property can actually close, or vice versa, extend the closing date until the date that that seller can actually move out. Or again, can't express enough, have an attorney draw it up. The closing team here, we have an in-house real estate attorney that will be happy to prepare all this stuff for you, William Anderson. So if you have any questions in regards to attorneys drafting stuff up, you can contact myself or Jonathan. We can put you in touch with him. But yeah, that's pretty much everything I've got going on. So 10 obstacles during to look out for during a transaction. So a lot of fun. Okay, so Layla, I'll call you when we get off here so we can kind of go over that a little bit more. Any questions in regards to this? Has anybody had any of these situations pop up, or anything different that really, hindered or kind of delayed the process, especially recently? All right, guys.
Everybody had easy transactions.
Yeah, I like that. Very smooth. None of mine ever are. I always have fun ones. Fun ones where my hair is going gray. So, my pleasure, you guys. I hope you guys got a lot of information out of this. If you have situations that are a little bit different to this, or you want to expand on this, you could always email support@locationre.com, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Anything that's more broker related, where you need a broker question, broker@locationre.com, and Jonathan and I can chime in, and we're always here to help you guys with whatever you need. So at this, I will bid you adieu. Make it a great day and get out there and sell something.
Thanks, Michelle. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.